Okay, we're going to start because, frankly, we just can't fit any more people in here. This is terrific. I guess there's a lot of interest in the Supreme Court for whatever reason. Anyway, good evening. Welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Alyssa Muscatine, and we're very delighted to be hosting law professor Stephen Vladeck, who's here to talk about his new book, The Shadow Docket: How the Supreme Court Uses Stealth Rulings to Amass Power and Undermine the Republic. You can't really tell where Steve stands, can you? Steve, of course, holds a chair in the law school at the University of Texas and has argued more than a dozen cases before the U.S. Supreme Court, the Texas Supreme Court, and various lower federal, civilian, and military courts. He also appears on CNN, as many of you, I'm sure, know. He appears there as a Supreme Court analyst, and he co-hosts the award-winning National Security Law podcast. Some fans out there. And additionally, he writes and edits One First, a weekly newsletter about the Supreme Court. So clearly, he's followed the court closely for a number of years and thought and written about its work. In the Shadow Docket, he examines the court's use, and many would say abuse, of a process under which the justices dispense many cases outside of how we tend to think they operate. And that is, they issue decisions in these cases without extensive briefings, without comprehensive oral arguments, and without signed opinions that detail their reasoning. This alternative behind-the-scenes process has existed in one form or another for many years, but historically it dealt mostly with non-controversial matters and existed largely to help the court manage its large caseload. In recent years, though, it's been employed differently and with much more significant impact by the court's conservative majority. Steve recounts how this has occurred and how it's helping the justices shift American jurisprudence to the right across a wide range of subjects, including abortion, asylum, election rules, redistricting maps, executions, public health measures, the Clean Air Act, and religious liberty. It was a conservative constitutional law professor at the University of Chicago who coined the term Shadow Docket 8 years ago. And Steve notes the label was meant then descriptively, not pejoratively. But as Steve argues persuasively in his book, the mounting number and significance of these unexplained, unsigned rulings is now truly alarming. This practice not only exacerbates perceptions of the court as engaging in political partisanship and failing to provide adequate guidance to lower courts and government authorities, but most disturbingly, Steve contends, it's undermining the justices' own legitimacy and threatening long-term institutional harm to the court. Steve's book is important and timely and written clearly and engagingly for both lawyers and non-lawyers alike. So it's truly worth reading. In conversation with Steve this evening will be another very close observer of the court, Mark Joseph Stern, who's a senior writer for Slate magazine. Mark holds a law degree from Georgetown University and is a member of the Maryland Bar. He's also the author of American Justice 2019, which examined the term that began in the fall of 2018 with Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation and saw the emergence of John Roberts as the new median vote among the justices, although that singular swing role, I guess, didn't last very long for him. Please join me in welcoming Steve and Mark.
Thank you so much, everybody. Steve and I are going to put these chairs to their ultimate test tonight. Thank you so much for coming out. It's really great to see all of you. This is an incredible showing. I've been to a lot of events here, and I have to say, this is the most packed house I've ever seen. I'm really...
They saw the cover and they thought it was a crime thriller.
I'm glad everybody is so riled up for a book about why the Supreme Court is doing bad things. That is something that I will say as a journalist, I have struggled to get across for many years, at least earlier in my career. But over the last few years, I would say, we've been seeing a lot more folks like Steve really come out and explain this problem that we have, specifically about the shadow docket, and talk about it in ways that everybody can understand, even though, of course, Steve is a brilliant professor who could be having these conversations in the ivory tower. Instead, he chooses to come down and talk to us about it, for which I am very grateful. So, Steve, I'm gonna ask. I'm just
tall.
I'm just going to throw you right into the fire, Steve. So the Supreme Court Press Corps, of which I am a member, is having kind of a moment of reckoning right now. We have failed to investigate the justices as public figures and government servants, and failed to expose their ethics violations. I think a lot of us were frankly afraid to be called cranks and partisans by the right, and to lose access to powerful people who would be offended by such reporting. But you, my brave man, you have been sharply critical of the shadow docket for a really long time, and now you have written a whole damn book all about it. And I'm curious, how did you decide that it was worth the many risks of writing a book as candid as this one to educate the public about the problem of the shadow docket?
Wow. You weren't kidding about jumping right into the fire. So I guess I really decided to write this book, I think it was late 2019 or early 2020, which was sort of, the middle of I would say the sort of the upslope of the mountain for the court's behavior on the shadow docket. It really reaches, I think, a peak in like 2020, 2021. And part of it was because I would be ranting on Twitter as usual about something the court had done in one of these orders that was just wildly inconsistent with whatever the relevant standard was, the precedents, etc. And there would be a lot of people who would respond like, can you explain this for non-lawyers? The court says, we're staying this injunction. What does that mean? I was like, well, actually, so it seemed to me that it actually was really important not just to write about the shadow docket, but to make that part of the court's work accessible to the folks who don't spend their days and nights thinking about, the All Writs Act. And part of that really was a story not just about sort of explaining what the current court was doing, but about putting it into historical context. So that when Justice Alito goes to Notre Dame Law School in September 2021 and gives a speech about how this is what we've always done, where are the receipts to say actually that's not true? And so the insight was that it ought to be possible to tell a story that's accessible to everyone about what is new and different about the current court's behavior and why those novelties and differences matter.
So you've invoked our dear friend Justice Alito, so I just have to ask, did you send him a copy of the book?
I did not.
Oh, huge missed opportunity.
I mean, there are a lot of people in this room who have access to the mails. So I am often, as I know you are, criticized and sometimes caricatured by folks who assume that I am coming at this simply as a progressive who means to attack the conservative justices. And I don't like to lean into that charge because, one, I don't think it's true, and two, I don't think it actually advances the debate. So I try to avoid at least the appearance that I'm literally trolling the justices who I'm criticizing. And I feel like if I sent the book to the justices who I criticize the most in the book, that might not be consistent.
Fair enough. Disappointing, but fair. So let's stick with Justice Alito for a moment, as I know everyone wants to do. You may not want to troll him, but he likes trolling you. You mentioned that Notre Dame speech in which he mentioned you and criticized you by name. Perhaps not everyone in this audience had the immense pleasure of watching that speech as I did, and so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about why he chose to give that speech at that moment in time, what the gist was, and why you became a part of it.
Sure. So to put this all in context, because I know there are a lot of folks in the room who aren't necessarily lawyers, right? So the part of the shadow docket that is the real source of criticism in the later chapters of the book is how the court handles what we call emergency applications. So basically when a party goes to the Supreme Court at a very early stage in a case and says, hey, Supreme Court, we need you to do something to the status quo, to either freeze the status quo or unfreeze the status quo for however long it takes this case to work its way all the way back to the court, which could be years. I mean, it could be months, years, whatever. I really think the inflection point in public awareness of and criticism of the court's behavior and the emergency side of the shadow docket was the SB 8 ruling, was in September of 2021 when a 5-4 majority refused to intervene to block Texas's 6-week abortion ban, 9.5 months before the decision in Dobbs that overruled Roe, when Roe was still good law. And I think that was the first time I suspect some of the folks in this room became familiar with the term shadow docket, with the idea of the shadow docket. And it really, there's the Chicago Policy Review has this study that basically shows like public discussion shifts radically and expands dramatically in the days and weeks after that ruling, to which me writing a book, I'm like, this is both amazing and terrible, right? You know, Justice Kagan's dissent in that case was the first time a justice had called out the conservative majority for using the shadow docket as such. She says, today's decision is emblematic of this court's shadow docket decision-making, which every day becomes more unreasoned, inconsistent, and impossible to defend. I was like, there's the epigraph for the book. But I think there was this groundswell in the days and weeks after that ruling. The Senate Judiciary Committee held, I think, a pretty visible hearing about the shadow docket and the abortion ban. The Wall Street Journal editorialized about it. And I think all of this impelled Justice Alito to push back. And so he gave this speech at Notre Dame Law School that originally wasn't even going to be public. And after there was some pressure, they streamed it live on the internet, although there's no public recording anywhere, but there might be private recordings out in the world.
Some of us know how to screen record.
But, you know, I think the Alito speech was also a bit of an inflection point because, by going out publicly and defending what the court was doing, I actually think he legitimized the conversation. And made it like an appropriate thing for us to be talking about, even as he's saying, like, just because, using the term as an attempt to delegitimize the court. I disagree vehemently with what he said in the speech, but I think giving the speech actually furthered that increased public awareness of and sort of specter of it. And I don't think it's a coincidence that there's a really important opinion by Justice Amy Coney Barrett that Justice Kavanaugh joins in a case about the COVID vaccine mandate for healthcare workers in the state of Maine, where Barrett basically says, hey, just because you've made out our criteria for granting emergency relief doesn't mean we actually have to grant it. That was October 29th, right? And that's over dissents from Thomas Alito and Gorsuch. And so I actually think that there really is this remarkable moment, and Alito's speech is part of it, where the justices become very aware of this story, and at least some of them start reacting to it.
So you've brought up abortion as one of the inflection points here. Can you talk about some of the other issues that were percolating up very rapidly toward the court that sort of led to this sudden rise of the use and abuse of the shadow docket just over the last couple of years? Sure.
I mean, so the book tries to basically pitch the first. I mean, there are lots of inflection points. I guess the book has too many inflection points. But if you look at just sort of the data, the real sort of uptick starts pretty early in the Trump administration, not because of anything unique to the Trump administration, but because of especially aggressive behavior by the Trump Justice Department. So just a data point that I think is, I don't want to make too much out of it because it's only one small slice of what's happening, but across the George W. Bush and Obama administration, so two slightly different two-term presidencies. Right, the government goes to the court for emergency relief a total of 8 times, so once every other year, and 7 of those don't even produce a public dissent. I mean, those are generally not especially divisive cases. Trump goes 41 times in 4 years. And the court grants 28 of those, right, in whole or in part, and most of those grants are over public dissents. So, I think part of the shift is just about the court's response to Trump applications, many of which were in response to either nationwide injunctions against Trump immigration policies or injunctions against the efforts to revive federal executions. Right, or other Trump initiatives. And so, there's this possibility that was just a Trump-specific phenomenon, that it was like this evanescent thing where the court is just reacting to lower court judges behaving badly, even though the lower court judges happen to be from across the ideological spectrum. And one of the things that's really remarkable is that when you get to January 2021 and beyond, the story continues. Right, it continues into the Biden administration. It continues in a whole bunch of COVID cases in 2020 and 2021 that have nothing to do with federal policies. So you really see different pockets where the court is using emergency applications to intervene and to sort of affect all of us in ways that were like once a decade, right, before the mid-2010s. And in ways that before really 2015, 2016, you only ever really saw in capital cases, in the death penalty context. You ask folks, I'm sure there are some in this room who clerked on the court in the 1980s or 90s or 2000s. What do you remember of the shadow docket? They'd say it was the death docket. Right, all we dealt with were last-minute applications for stays of execution or unstay executions. That's the shift in like the mid-2010s, is away from the death penalty specifically and toward every federal policy and many state policies as appropriate fodder for these kinds of orders.
You have a chapter, perhaps my favorite chapter, hard to pick, that's titled Read the Opinion. And I'm wondering if you could just give us the backstory there and why that title is so damn good.
If you had asked me if I had to guess which chapter was your favorite chapter, that would have been my guess. It's chapter 7 of the book. It's where I sort of try to tie all the threads together. Because the book, one of the things I try to do in the book, the first half of the book is really meant to speak to everyone. And it's meant to contextualize the court and its docket and its history. And then it gets a little more sort of pointed and critical and first-person-y, right, toward the end. And so chapter 7 is where I think you really get to the meat of the critique. The Read the Opinion, that is a quote from a speech that Justice Amy Coney Barrett gave at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library in April of 2022. And Justice Barrett gave this speech. She knew, as we would soon find out, that there were these fairly divisive rulings on the merits docket coming down the pike in Dobbs, in Bruin, in the West Virginia versus EPA environmental case. And she says, hey, before you judge us, before you dismiss us as, her words, not mine, partisan hacks, right? She says, don't just listen to lovely journalists like Mark, right? Read the opinion, she says, right? Decide for yourselves if we have provided analyses. Not necessarily because you're going to agree with our analysis, but maybe you'll at least agree that it's analysis and that there are principles there, even if they're not your principles. And I thought that was actually a very consistent position. If you look at how the court has talked about its moral authority historically, this is a common theme. In Casey, the joint opinion of Justices O'Connor, Kennedy, and Souter, right, talks about how the court's legitimacy springs from its ability to provide principled justifications for its decision making. So 2 days later, right, 2 days after this speech, there's a 5-4 ruling on the shadow docket where the court puts back into effect a Trump-era environmental regulation that makes it, I would say, easier for certain types of power plants to pollute nearby waterways. And there was no opinion to read. Right? And so, part of what I find remarkable about the whole sort of arc of the conversation is that there's a degree of, I think, tone deafness on the part of at least some of the justices about this kind of critique, even when in some of their other behavior they seem to be reacting to it.
Are you suggesting that conservative justices might be out of touch with the American people or not care what they think about the job that the court's doing?
Was that a question? So, I mean, listen. I try really hard in the book, perhaps too hard, and I get criticized for this from other sides of the aisle. I don't know what I meant by that. I don't. You do not have to think that any of the justices are acting in bad faith, right? To still think that a lot of this behavior is problematic. I suspect there are folks in this room who I would never persuade that the justices aren't acting in bad faith, and that's fine. I mean, it's a free country, except maybe parts of Texas. I still have tenure for the moment, but I do. I mean, I really want the book. You know, some of the book is provocative, right? But I really do want the book to be attractive and appealing even to folks who are willing to believe in the sort of the better angels, right, of all of the justice nature. Because, you know, part of the story here is that I think at least some of what happened on the shadow docket starting in 2017 was not necessarily malicious. It was just unconscious. And it was just, oh, we can do this thing, and we can keep doing this thing, and we'll just keep doing. Like, I actually think there was no coordinated response, as opposed to what happens on the merits docket, where I think there's a lot more strategy and agenda setting. And that's where I think the court just sort of dug itself deeper into a hole.
So what would you say to someone who comes up and says, Steve, loved the book, want an autograph, but it kind of seems to me like I don't care if the court takes away the right to abortion in a 1-paragraph order in the dead of night or in a 90-page rant by a misogynistic justice. They're still taking away the right to reproductive autonomy. Why should I care so much about process when the outcome is bad in either way?
Because one is an exercise of judicial power and one's an exercise of political power. Right? Because, you know, the court is going to hand down wrong-headed substantive decisions for as long as the court exists. You know, find me an era of the Supreme Court where you thought every single decision the court handed down was right, and I'll find you like 3 months in 1965. Right? And maybe not even that. Exactly. And for every Lochner, there's a Jacobson. That was, okay, 5 of you got that joke. Okay. So, I mean, this is where, I am a process person. I am a law professor who teaches civil procedure in federal courts. You know, where you stand is a function of where you sit. But I really do think that the court, following its own appropriate processes and handing down a decision that we just disagree with, right, is actually innate in what the court is. Right, in ways that, you know, sort of handing down unsigned, unexplained orders that affect all of us, that change the status quo, where the best explanation for the behavioral pattern in the aggregate is the partisan valences of the dispute and not any coherent through line of legal principle, right? That's not judicial power on the court's own articulation of what judicial power is. And so I would say, yes, one is worse than the other. And you know, this is, I might get kicked out for saying this, but this is where I think the SB 8 decision is worse than Dobbs.
Expand.
Well, because, right, I mean, so in the SB 8 context, right, the court is allowing a state to effectively get rid of a right the court has not yet gotten rid of, right, through procedural contrivances that everyone knew were contrivances, by relying on, you know, sort of the specter of unsettled procedural questions that the court could have settled. Coming at the same time, coming in a moment where the court had spent most of the last 10 months repeatedly intervening to block state COVID restrictions in contexts in which there were procedural questions or even procedural obstacles that the court runs roughshod over, right? And that to me is a real problem for the court as an institution that goes well beyond how you interpret the right to abortion in the Constitution, right? And, you know, don't take my word for it. I mean, right, this is not like one of the, you know, it's just progressives. No, one of the dissenters in many of these cases is John Roberts, right? I mean, Chief Justice Roberts dissented in the SB 8 case. He dissents in the Alabama redistricting case in February 2022. He dissented in the Clean Water case where there was no opinion. Why is he dissenting? When he writes, what he's saying is like, you know, I'm not sympathetic to the position of the liberal justices, but I do think that there's a right way and a wrong way for us to be acting.
So it's very clear from your answers tonight and from the book that you care a lot about the court, that the court is an institution that you care deeply about. And so when it does this kind of fly-by-night shoddy work, it makes you tear your hair out. I want to read a quote from the book. You say, "We need not just a Supreme Court in name, but a Supreme Court in reality, a tribunal that is legitimate and that is perceived as legitimate by a sufficiently large body of citizens." I think a lot of progressives today would disagree. And I'm curious what you think is so important about the court and its legitimacy that it's crucial for people like you and other progressives to try to shore up that legitimacy at a time when the court is rapidly shifting the law to the right and also seizing more and more power from the other branches for itself.
But how do you really feel? So, there are ways to design constitutional systems that don't have a very powerful Supreme Court in them. And there are examples abound. I mean, Britain, I think, is a pretty good example of a pretty decent constitutional system with a not very you can probably name justices on the UK Supreme Court, but I don't know that there are that many people in the audience who can. Our system is not that system, right? Our system is structured, for better or for worse, in a way where we really do depend upon the federal courts in general and the Supreme Court in particular as like the last bulwark against tyranny of the majority, or the not so majority, as the case may be. And that may not be a comfortable thing to say at a moment where these justices are the bulwark. But I will just say, look at 2020. Look at what happened in the 2020 election context, where there were efforts by President Trump and his supporters to get the federal courts in general, and the Supreme Court in particular, right, to get in the middle of the election and muck everything up. Bless you. And the court didn't. Right? The court, I think to its credit, yes, this is kind of like a participation trophy, but the court stayed out. Right? And I think that that's a pretty powerful, imagine how much worse that would have been if the court had given any daylight to any of those lawsuits, to Texas's, FACACTA original lawsuit against Pennsylvania and 3 other states. Right? So I guess, yes, it's a little bit idealistic. You might even call it a bit naive, but I guess I just think that if we have a repeat of 2000 at some point in the near future, where the entire presidential election comes down to a single state, and where the single state is basically a mathematical tie, right? And the Supreme Court is asked to resolve some kind of dispute, I think it's much better for the country that the court that resolves that dispute be perceived as legitimate than not.
So you're saying you want another Bush v. Gore?
I'm saying I want a court that has the credibility to issue another Bush versus Gore, versus a court that doesn't, right? And I think the perils of a court that doesn't have the credibility that the Supreme Court had, and then I think unfortunately abused, right, in December of 2000, are pretty ominous. Because if the court can't decisively resolve that, who will? So we're full of sunshine tonight.
Well, let's shine some sunshine into this bookstore, because I think one of the things I love about your book is that it does kind of have a list of things for Congress to do to fix the problem. It's not just a list of complaints. And, I think this really ties into current events that many people in this audience may be paying attention to. Harlan Crow, Clarence Thomas's...
He loves the book.
Yeah. Clarence Thomas's billionaire benefactor, Harlan Crow, recently took time out of rereading his signed copy of Mein Kampf to send a letter to the Senate Judiciary Committee declaring that it is literally unconstitutional for Congress to investigate his friendship with Clarence Thomas. And Harlan Crow's reasoning echoed another recent letter by our dear friend Chief Justice John Roberts, suggesting that it would violate the separation of powers for the Senate Judiciary Committee to call him to testify about judicial ethics. Seems to me like both Mr. Crow and Chief Justice Roberts might need a refresher on all of the ways that Congress has and can regulate the court in the past. I'm wondering if you could remind us on some of the ways it can do that.
Sure. I will just say, in partial defense of Chief Justice Roberts, I think what he said was it would raise separation of powers concerns. Yeah, you say potato, I say Article 3. This is actually, the book is specifically about this very nerdy thing, right? Emergency applications to the Supreme Court. But if there's a broader sort of vibe, sort of a zeitgeist, right? It really is the sort of the breakdown of the separation of powers. And if you tell the history of Congress's regulation of the Supreme Court, let's just check off some fun moments. So 1802, Congress says, "Hey, Supreme Court, don't even bother meeting this year. We don't need you." It's like the 1904 World Series. Never happened. See, 7 of you got that joke. See, right? 1868, right? The court is hearing a really important case about the constitutionality of Reconstruction. Keep in mind they're hearing it in the old Senate chamber, right, which is where the court sat until 1935. Congress says, "You know what? We don't want you to decide this case." It takes jurisdiction away. The Supreme Court says, "Yep, you can do that." Right? The court, the justices had to ride the circuit, right? Sometimes on horseback. All the way up until 1911, even though by that point it had long since outlived any usefulness. Why are we sending the justices out around the country to ride circuit? To remind them that, Congress pulls the levers. My favorite example, 1964, Congress votes a pay raise to every single federal judge, a long overdue pay raise, but the justices get the lowest pay raise because Congress wanted to send a message that it was unhappy with some of the court's decision making. Right? So each of these might seem small, but if you take them in the aggregate, there are lots of examples of Congress actually regulating the docket of the court, the travel of the justices, except on yachts. Right, the sort of the budget or salary of the court, so long as Congress was not diminishing the salary, which Article 3 says it can't do. And I think what the Chief Justice's letter really says to me is that we have forgotten all of that, and we've just gotten out of the practice of thinking that part of Congress's job is to actually pull levers and exert leverage over the court, much the same way as you could say about Congress and the executive branch. Right, over much of the last 30, 40, 50 years. And I guess, I feel bad sort of coming to DC and not quoting the Federalist at least once. But so Madison in Federalist 51 says ambition must be made to counteract ambition. Plenty of ambition in the court, not really a lot of ambition in Congress to counteract that ambition right now.
And why do you think that is? You say in the book, we are in the longest period without legislation altering the Supreme Court's jurisdiction in the nation's history. Why are we in this dry spell, and what do I have to do to make it stop?
DC statehood would, okay.
It means something to us, Steve.
I used to live here.
Used to.
So I will just say, when we moved to Texas in 2016, Karen had a funny line about how when people said, your senator is going to be Ted Cruz, right? And her response was, "We'll have a Democratic senator before you will."
Boo, Karen! That burns.
Was she wrong? That burns, and was she wrong? Welcome to my life. I think to me, part of what has happened is sort of a broader story that's not about the court at all, which is the shift from the separation of powers to the separation of parties, right? The extent to which Congress now is sort of out of the business of doing institutional things for the sake of doing institutional things. I think you could trace that in turn to polarization. Right, gone are the days in which there are liberal Republicans who are to the left of conservative Democrats. But that's true on the courts too. And so, I think part of the question is, how do we tell a story about the Supreme Court that doesn't just have everyone retreating into their partisan camps, right? How do we tell a story about the court as an institution that actually needs fixing and needs input from the other branches in ways that are not simply meant to destroy the power of the current conservative majority? And I think that's a conversation that may be not as exciting or thrilling or salivating for folks who dream of 4 new seats on the court to be filled by a Democratic president.
I'd put you in one of them, to be clear.
That wouldn't solve the problem. But it wouldn't. Right. You could put, you could put William O. Douglas and Hugo Black and Thurgood Marshall and Pickham, and it wouldn't solve the problem of the court's unaccountability. It would just make it less visible that the court was not accountable, right? And so, to me, this is getting a bit beyond the book. But I think part of the undertone of the book is, the court was, even when it was doing lots of bad things for much of its history, it was accountable. And a lot of what we're seeing today is a court that's just not accountable at all. And just one really, really silly small example of this. This term, right, the court, we talked about the shadow docket. Let's talk about the merits docket for a second. The court's going to hand down maybe 57 decisions on the merits docket this term. It's going to be the 4th term in a row that the court doesn't get to 60. Before 2019, the last time the court's docket had been that small was 1864. Now, you guys might be saying, great, decide fewer cases. I would prefer a court that decides 5 cases a term. But actually, what's missing is the court acting like a court, right? What's missing is those parts of the justice's docket that are not high-profile, socially divisive, statutory or constitutional issues, where historically the court actually, made its bed, right? Where it really sort of was able to, be a court and not just an arm of political power.
So this theme of accountability runs all through the book. But of course, I could quote you 1,000 different shoddily written Wall Street Journal editorials right now that say the court is not supposed to be accountable. It's supposed to sit above and beyond the other 2 branches of government. What is your response to that line of thinking, which is very powerful on the right now?
Bullshit. No, I mean, listen. I am, as progressives go, I am probably about as firm a defender of judicial independence as there is. Independence is not anathema to accountability, right? And it never has been. I mean, right? Each of the branches are independent. That doesn't mean they're unaccountable. The deal we made, the deal the Constitution makes, is we're going to have unelected federal judges who remain accountable through all of these other levers. Not that we're going to have unaccountable judges who can do whatever the hell they want. And those levers are political levers to be pulled by the political branches who are themselves politically accountable. If you look at the court's history, there are lots of examples of political pressure actually exerting itself on the court and pushing the justices to change their ways. Like, that's not bad, that's the system. And so I think it's actually really dangerous to go down this road where accountability is somehow inconsistent with independence. That's not what anyone thought at the founding. It's not how anyone acted for the first 150, 175 years of the court as an institution. And I think it's conflating 2 very different things.
Do you think that pursuing ethics, as Senate Democrats are trying sort of to do right now, is a valid and legitimate way to increase accountability for the court? Or do you think it's really just a smokescreen for Democrats who are angry with the court's decisions and want to strike back any way they can?
Yes. No, I mean, I think, right, if you talk, I mean, it depends on who we're talking about, right? So I would, there are bills that I think are designed simply to rein in the court for the sake of reining in the court. And then there are bills like the one that Senator King and Senator Murkowski introduced. The King-Murkowski bill, it's this remarkably sort of, I would say, I was going to say milquetoast, but I feel like after events of the last 24 hours, I can't. Right? But it's a very middle-of-the-road bill, right? The Murkowski-King bill basically says, hey, Supreme Court, you need to adopt a bunch of rules, right? We're not going to tell you what the rules are. You tell us what the rules are. And you need to hire someone who's actually going to enforce those rules. And you need to have that person who you've hired report to us when justices break the rules, just in case we need to impeach them, right? Like, that's basically the bill. I don't see how that's remotely unconstitutional, right? And yet even that, right, is pilloried by, right-wing columnists as a clear affront to the separation of powers. That bill strikes me as a serious, if fairly, soft punching attempt. Just to say, hey, justices, we want you to do this thing. We're not going to tell you how to do it. We're just going to tell you that you have to do it. And that seems, if that's unconstitutional, then we might as well just get out of the business.
Well, and yet it was pilloried, as you say. It stands no chance of passing the Senate. But you're also up here sort of preaching the value of not retreating to our partisan corners and of coming together to find solutions that aren't based in politics. How do we square those 2 things? How do we square the ideal of everyone coming together to actually restore judicial accountability as the framers envisioned it with the reality that when an independent and a moderate Republican introduce the kind of weakest ethics bill you can imagine, it gets laughed out of the Senate and mocked ruthlessly by right-wing columnists.
So I'm a lawyer, not a political scientist. Not my problem. No. So I think by having conversations like this, I mean, I don't mean to be trite. Like, I think the principal goal of the book is to elevate public conversation about the Supreme Court, is to try to affect the discourse in a way where we're not just falling into the same Dobbs bad, Roe good framing of all conversations, right? And I think, if there are folks who are capable of being persuaded that it's in everyone's interest, no matter where you sit on the political spectrum, for the court to generally be perceived as a healthier, higher functioning institution, a more responsible player in our system, then maybe the change is incremental, maybe it's small, maybe it's just granting emergency relief less often, or not doing it at 11:58 p.m. so Mark can sleep, right? But it's change. And, I think, I guess I come from the line of Mets fans who believe that change starts with very small things like a new owner, right? And that, better to sort of try different ways of changing the debate than just giving up.
Just a quick note, in a few minutes, we're going to begin Q&A. We would like an orderly process. There is a microphone up here next to the pillar. If you can't see it, you will when you approach. Please form an orderly line at the microphone at your leisure, and we will get to as many questions as we can before 8 p.m.
Although if I'm keeping with the theme of the book, my answers will be unsigned and unexplained.
So I want to bring this back to close where I began, which is this is obviously a huge issue. It's making a splash. Your book is a bestseller. Can we get a round of applause for that?
I think that says more about the times we live in than the book.
Take some goddamn credit, Steve, for Christ's sake. It's a good book. So I'm in the media. I'm covering this stuff. I gotta say, when it began, it was a struggle to figure out how to explain it to people. I think that a lot of my colleagues in the Supreme Court press corps also struggled. This was a relatively new phenomenon. You said you're a law professor, not a political scientist. You're also kind of a journalist, but just pretend you're not. Sit on the sidelines and tell us, what grade do we get in reporting on the shadow docket? Are we doing a good job explaining this stuff? Are we conveying the importance of it to the American people, or are we dropping the ball?
Is this law school grades, college grades, elementary school grades?
The most generous curve that you've ever given.
So I think improving. I'm reminded of the assessment that our 4.5-year-old just got for trying to do cartwheels inside the classroom. Maybe we should work on not doing cartwheels inside the classroom. So I actually think, this is, first of all, Mark, I put you, at the leading edge of the press corps when it comes to being reactive to this stuff. I think that there are two things to say. The first is I think the press corps has gotten the message. And the book actually tells the story back to the Clean Water ruling from April 2022, where Barrett was the dispositive vote, and John Roberts joins the 3 Democratic appointees in dissent. Roberts wasn't just a dissenter, he actually signed on to Justice Kagan's dissent. And you could hardly see a story about that ruling that didn't flag the significance of John Roberts joining Justice Kagan and criticizing the shadow docket as such. That was a far cry from 2 years earlier, right? So I think there's been improvement. I think there's a larger problem that you've written about, that Dolly has written about, that Jay Willis has written about, which is the Supreme Court press corps is largely dependent on the court to cover it in ways that I don't think we would see the White House press corps being dependent upon the White House and the congressional press corps, et cetera. And I think there's a stickier question there, not about how the press corps describes what the court is doing, but about how the press corps sort of prioritizes describing things that the court isn't doing. So just one example, right? The court's going to decide 57 cases this term, right? In a whole bunch of those, the court will have either only granted some of the case or will have rewritten the questions presented. That should be part of stories about these decisions, right? The court, when you get out, the court was unanimous in 14 cases. Yes, the court that chose the cases it was going to hear chose some cases that were easy. Again, participation trophies. So I think there's progress. I still think there is a way in which the coverage of the court, especially as we enter the big month, right, June, tends to really get distracted by the bright lights, where there's process stories, where there are institutional stories to tell, even in the context of the affirmative action cases. Good example in the affirmative action cases, the court rushed the affirmative action cases onto its docket. In the North Carolina case, the court granted certiorari before judgment, leapfrogging over, right, the Fourth Circuit. That should be part of the story, right? That like, hey, here's a court that was in a big hurry to decide affirmative action. I'm not sure it will be, except now it'll be in yours.
I could ask this guy a million more questions, but we've already got a fearsomely long line. Everybody give it up for Steve. And now ask him the hardest questions you can think of. First up.
Yeah, I have to start off with a nerdy question. At the very beginning, you mentioned that the uptick in the use of the shadow docket at least started as in part a response to nationwide injunctions that were being issued primarily by liberal judges striking down immigration bans. So my question is, to what extent do you think the uptick in the shadow docket correlates with the uptick in the issuance of nationwide injunctions by both liberal and conservative judges?
Thanks. Yeah, it's a great question. So I think there's at least a loose correlation. But part of the problem, I mean, one of the things about writing this book is I really tried to anticipate and sort of fold in all of the attempted justifications, right? Like, this is why this happened as opposed to this. So nationwide injunctions, these are injunctions that are not just limiting the defendant from acting against the plaintiff, but they're actually limiting the defendant from acting against anyone. Right? Probably more accurate to call them non-plaintiff specific injunctions, but even the lawyers would, fall asleep at that term. The problem with sort of thinking that it's about the rise of nationwide injunctions is twofold. One, even in the Trump cases, I said there were 41 applications. Fewer than half of those were about nationwide injunctions. Right? A bunch of the Trump cases were actually about more tailored injunctions or subpoenas or other sort of demands that were not the nationwide injunction bugaboos. Two, again, this is where I think putting the whole thing in context matters. If it was really about hostility to nationwide injunctions, you would have expected that hostility to persist into a Democratic administration. Justice Gorsuch and Justice Thomas both wrote separately in different cases during the Trump administration about how nationwide injunctions are a real problem and we ought to take up a case where we can limit them. The next nationwide injunction against a Biden policy that either of them vote against will be the first. So, again, like the explanation falls apart when you look at the justices' behavior across multiple valences. I do think nationwide injunctions are a problem because what they do is they raise the stakes of a lower court decision in ways that you might not see for a plain vanilla injunction. But the COVID cases are just another whole set of cases that weren't nationwide injunctions at all. And so the court's behavior, I think, is sort of not directly a response to and not entirely about nationwide injunctions as such.
Okay,
Thanks.
Hi.
Hello.
So first, I just want to say I want to thank you for being one of the only lawyers on Twitter who doesn't make things worse when you tweet about student debt. So thank you. And I guess my question is, what role has Federalist Society had through their roles on law schools and grooming judges in creating this whole mess, and why are they welcomed at law schools? Just an easy question, not political at all.
No. Okay. I think let me sort of take the first question and figure out how to not answer the second. So to the first question, I think there's no question, and the narrative of the book I think is consistent with this, that you can see the sort of the problematic behavior of the court accelerate. First in 2018 when Justice Kavanaugh is confirmed to replace Justice Kennedy, and then especially in 2020 when Justice Barrett is confirmed to replace Justice Ginsburg. I don't know that has anything to do with the Federalist Society as such, but rather is just a solidification of a majority on one side of the ideological spectrum. I can't prove, right, that if things had gone differently in 2016 and Merrick Garland was now median vote on a 6-3 liberal court, right, that we wouldn't see some of the same behavior. So I don't think there's nothing inherently conservative or ideological about what the court is doing. I think it's just, to quote Lord Acton, power corrupts. To the point about sort of law schools, I teach at the flagship public university in the state of Texas. One of the things we have going for us is intellectual diversity. And it seems to me that it's incumbent upon us, especially these days, to hear all points of view so that people can go and say why those points of view are completely fakakta. And this, I mean, I go through this every time, I'm invited to speak at what our, UT has a very robust and very good FedSoc chapter, and they're kind enough, or insert adjective enough, to invite me to a bunch of their events. And I will go to UT events and debate almost anyone. I won't go to non-UT events because that's my obligation to my students. And I think that's part of the job. Wow, okay. You guys are an easy audience.
Hi, Professor Vladeck. How, if at all, do you think this book and your
Speaking of UT, sorry.
Oh yeah, I'm one of his students.
Your grades come in.
I have to stop myself from asking when it is, but so how do you think this book and kind of your role and your viral criticisms of the court has impacted your role as an advocate before the court?
Well, I mean, my record before the book was 0-3, so I have nowhere to go but up. So, listen, I think this is Mark's first question in a way, right? Like, I think I am a scholar and an academic first, and an advocate second. And I have the luxury of not having standing clients for whom I have to take institutional positions. And so, I get to pick and choose my cases based on cases where I want to be involved in, where I believe in the thing we're doing. And I'll just say, if there are justices who are like, oh, we should grant that case, except that Vladeck's on the petition, I think that says more about them than about me. But maybe that's naive. I don't know.
All right, thanks.
Yeah.
Hi, welcome back. First off, we're down 1-0, mid-third.
Yeah.
So
Mets fans, man.
What else is new?
Yeah.
But my question is, in the book and here tonight, you talked a lot about what Congress can do.
Yeah.
Is there anything that Chief Justice Roberts can do to police his own house, or is he just going to stand by and let everything go like the rest of everything?
Chief Justice Roberts is not, in this context, a parent of children, right? He is first among equals, right? He has no authority to tell the other 8 justices what to do about anything other than opinion assignments, which is, important but limited in this context. He has the bully pulpit, which I don't think he's used very much, right? I'm sure that his job is a lot of fun right now. I'll just say, so I think the sort of the short answer is there's not much he can do to coerce the other 8 justices. There are examples he can set. There are things he can do to try to lead. And I will just say, not that I am suggesting this, but it is worth saying out loud, that if he really thinks that the future of the court is on the line, he can resign. And give the center seat to a Democratic president with a Democratic Senate. Okay, yeah, and the Mets are going to win the World Series.
You gotta believe.
Yeah. I would not put money on either of those things happening. But so the point is just that, his principal power is what he can say, right, both behind the scenes and publicly, not what he can do. And I think, the question is how he chooses to wield that power.
All right, thanks.
Hi. One of the problems, it would seem, about restoring the integrity or the sense of public perception of the integrity of the court is that the conservative majority has, in particular, weakened the political, the Congress through its watering down of voting rights and gerrymandering and so on. Albeit that, sure, there are some Democratic states that have gerrymandered, but it's predominantly in the red states.
One of them's a couple miles that way, or a couple feet that way.
Yeah. So it seems, in a sense, it seems that the Roberts majority, and Roberts even before he had the majority, they were working on behalf of insulating themselves from the Congress.
Yeah, I mean, so I think it's definitely a fair criticism of the court that its voting rights jurisprudence and its gerrymandering jurisprudence have complicated the political story in some pretty problematic ways. I still think that in a world in which Congress, and I mean this like members across the ideological spectrum, saw their job as, checking the court no matter who was in charge of it, those decisions would matter less. I mean, not less in the grand scheme, but they would matter less insofar as inhibiting Congress's checking function. And so, to me, like, part of the story here is like, how do I appeal to, members of the House in Texas who might be very, very happy with the way the court is going substantively, but who ought to be invested in the court being healthy institutionally. And that's a story that ought to be told regardless of gerrymandering or limiting the VRA.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Liz, and I'm with Our Children's Trust, and we represent the 21 youth plaintiffs from the Juliana versus United States case. And we certainly thank you for your scholarship and your work. We have used it in our work as well. And you mentioned in your Harvard Law Review article that this is a case that is a striking example of the shadow docket. And as you may know, the Trump DOJ filed 6 writs of mandamus in our case. And as you also may know, we are currently in the U.S. District Court, and the ruling should happen any day now on the motion to amend the complaint. And if the Biden DOJ files a 7th writ of mandamus, what is your take? This is a case where the kids are just trying to get to trial.
Yeah.
And is this a misuse of the shadow docket?
So I guess I will just say the Biden Justice Department, some members of whom might be in this room, are maybe not necessarily the same thing as the Trump Justice Department. And I don't know that the Biden administration would be in quite as much of a hurry to take an extraordinary writ up on whatever the district court does in the Juliana case. But I do think, there's a larger story here about just sort of how everything has become an emergency. Where, I think 15, 20 years ago, the Juliana litigation, whatever folks think of what the district court did initially, the reaction would have been, this is not an emergency, right? And so the government can sort of appeal in the normal course as opposed to all of the extraordinary measures that the Trump administration pursued. Now, right, there's a mindset that I think is prevalent not just on the court, but even among lower courts, that almost everything's an emergency. That any time any court blocks anything a government's doing, it's some kind of emergency. And I think that this is not a Juliana-specific story, but I think it's a story about, like, how do we get back to a world in which we understand that, like, injunctions are not per se emergencies, that the government is not irreparably harmed if it's stopped from carrying out its policies for a couple of days, right? Like, that it's more complicated. And so that's hopefully where this is going, maybe with some help from DOJ.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, I'm Eliza. Hey. Can you talk about how the lack of Title VII protections for judiciary employees is related to the lack of judicial accountability, and where you weigh that in terms of court ethics priorities, like the JAA versus Supreme Court ethics? Is one more likely to become law than the other?
Well, this is, Eliza, you know more about this than anyone, I think, in the world. And I'm saying nice things even though you're wearing a Williams sweatshirt in front of me.
Sorry.
Come on, man. Western Massachusetts colleges, we take them seriously.
Yes, we do.
So I think it's the same story. Right, and I think it's or at least it's the different side of the same coin, where it's a mentality that, like, the normal kinds of accountability mechanisms shouldn't apply to the judiciary, and that's true on the sort of misconduct side, personally, right, in addition to financially. So, I see this, I would hope that any comprehensive set of reforms would include that kind of judicial misconduct as well, but maybe it's possible that those reforms actually have an even better chance.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yes, me again. For those who don't know, I used to be a student. A very vocal and disagreeable one.
Just vocal.
Related to your point on emergencies and that injunctions are not requests for injunctive relief are not necessarily emergencies. There is a concept called concept creep, and certain things seem to have a strongly disproportionate effect on the scope of attention, not merely the time taken up. I would argue that the increasing reliance on requests for injunctive relief by the DOJ and other parties tends to take up a disproportionate amount of the court's time and moral reasoning. And as such, the rationale of the emergency that prompted the request for injunctive relief will also erode the court's distinction between what is timely and what is not.
So, I think there's no question that there's at least correlation between how much more active the court has been on emergency applications in the last 6 or 7 years and the decreasing size of the merits docket. Proving that it's causation, I think there are 9 people who can prove that.
Let's see, David E. Lavari, dissertation 2018.
Okay, for the second edition. But I mean, the larger point, though, is I think there's also a story here that's further into the weeds, but still a story, that these cases consume oxygen, right? And they take up resources. And if you do believe, as I do, that there are entire swaths of jurisprudence that the court is staying out of that maybe it shouldn't, right? The court has largely stopped taking up direct appeals in state criminal cases, which used to be a real sort of chunk of its docket. There are costs not just to what the court's doing on the emergency side of the docket when it's spending more time on them, no doubt.
Hi, my name's Tom, and I actually was a student of your father's. You mentioned that you were from D.C., so I wanted to tell a story. This will be less legal and more. You were probably around 10, and one day I was walking back from class at Georgetown on the Hill, past Union Station and up Massachusetts Avenue, and I ended up behind your father and you.
Uncle.
Oh, uncle. Your uncle.
There are 2 of them.
Ah.
Actually, there are 3 if you count my aunt.
Okay. Well, maybe this wasn't. Anyway, we were in front of the Heritage Foundation, and he was explaining to the 2 boys with him that about the First Amendment. And the question I have is, how is it to have grown up in a family that not only has several, one generation, but 2 generations, your grandmother being a very respected attorney. How did that form how you are today?
Thanksgiving was rough. So my little sister, I have 2 sisters, and my younger sister is the only one who's not a lawyer. My older sister's a lawyer. My dad's not a lawyer, but his siblings were lawyers. His parents were lawyers. My grandmother was Columbia Law School class of 1947. As she would say, 9 years before RBG. She was very insistent about that. She argued a case in the court in 1981. She lost. So it's a family tradition. Although Uncle David actually has 1, 2, right? I think he's 3. I thought you lost it. Hey, see? So this is, if you need a Vladeck, go to him. But so my little sister, when I was in law school, she was an undergrad and we were at Yale at the same time, which she hated except for the fact that it meant she could use my car. And she came to the moot court finals when I was a 3L, and she had never seen an appellate argument before. And so she comes up to me after, she says, "I finally get it." I said, "What?" She said, "I finally understand Thanksgiving." But I mean, listen, I'll put it this way. I clerked for Marcia Berzon on the Ninth Circuit. And she knows my entire family, including my grandmother. And her assessment of me by the time I was done clerking is that I'm the conservative in the family. And I think that's probably right. So it's a cool tradition to be part of. And it made for some awkward OCI interviews when I was in law school. Because everyone is being sued by my grandmother.
One last question.
Hi, thank you for coming here, and thank you for writing this book. I know you mentioned Justice Roberts retiring. I wanted to actually ask about...
Not seriously.
Well,
Manifest it,
okay.
everybody.
I suppose I'm asking more seriously about Justice Sotomayor. I know she's turning 70 next year. We have Democrats probably going to lose the Senate next year as well. They may have to win 3 consecutive elections by 5 points or more in order to get it back, which could mean maybe 15, 20 years of a Republican Senate. I'm wondering, given that, a confirmation of any successor to her depends on the health of Dianne Feinstein, do you think Justice Sotomayor should maybe announce her retirement, maybe even effective June 2024? I know it's a tough one, but maybe effective June 2024. Announce it now and, save us from a court that could become entrenched till maybe the 2070s, 2080s, if we get to a 7-2 majority.
Wow.
Food for thought.
Seriously. So, I mean, I will just say, if I had been at the lunch that President Obama had with Justice Ginsburg, I don't know what I would have said. Right? I mean, these are humans, and they are political creatures, but they're also humans who know themselves and they know their bodies and they know their futures, hopefully better than I do. I don't think it's my place to say that Justice Sotomayor should resign. I can see the arguments for it. I can also see the arguments against it. I think her voice is unique on the court right now in a lot of ways that are not just unique to the current court, but actually that the court hasn't had since Justice Marshall retired in 1993, or not 93, 91. That would have been better. Right. I think the justices have to keep their own counsel on that. But I do think that, hopefully if there's a lesson from the Ginsburg story, is that counsel should be informed by a realistic assessment of the politics and the actuarial tables such as they are.
Wow, and we're closing it out on actuarial tables. Thank you, Steve.
So copies of Steve's book